Hello, everyone, and welcome to Creation Justice Summer Reads. My name is Derek Weston, and I am the Theological Education and Training Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Today's program is the second part of a summer series exploring books on climate change and creation justice in conversation with the authors of those books. You can watch previous webinars on our YouTube page, youtube.com/Creation Justice Ministries. Please subscribe so you can follow along with any videos we share. Before we begin, a few housekeeping things to note. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you've not yet, and be sure to select all panelists and all participants. We have a short Q&A session at the end of the program. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function and not in the chat. And this workshop is being recorded and will be sent out to all participants via email next week. And just so you all know, we still have copies of the two books that we'll be discussing. They are available for purchase, and you can use the link that you use for registration to purchase either book or both books together. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists today, our authors. First is Laura Alary. She is a writer, educator, and storyteller. She has loved books since she was barely big enough to clamber up the steps of the bookmobile that rolled into her neighborhood once a week. These days, she's happy to be surrounded by books in the library where she works, and she delights in writing stories that make us bigger on the inside. Among her recent books are What Grew in Larry's Garden, Sun in My Tummy, The Astronomer Who Questioned Everything, and the upcoming All the Faces of Me. Laura grew up by the ocean in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and spent many happy hours exploring the beaches of Prince Edward Island, one of her favorite spots on this dot we call home. She now makes her home in Toronto, where she likes to walk by the lake and think about how she can be a better ancestor. And Wilson Dickinson is a scholar, minister, and community organizer whose work takes place at the intersection of philosophical theology, sustainability, social justice, and spiritual practice. He teaches theology and is the director of the Doctor of Ministry and Continuing Education program at Lexington Theological Seminary. He is the author of The Green Good News, in addition to Singing the Psalms with My Son, which we'll be talking about today. He's also the director of the Green Good News, an organization that is rooted in a number of food justice ministries and which educates, cultivates, and organizes Christian communities to follow the ways of justice, joy, and simplicity. And he's also an ordained minister in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. So thank you, both of you, for being here, and welcome to our webinar.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
And I haven't actually introduced the books. The books here are Singing the Psalms with My Son, Praying and Parenting for a Healed Planet. This is Wilson's book. And Laura's book is Here, the Dot We Call Home. And they're both lovely books. And one of the things that I always love to ask authors is where the ideas of their books came from. And I want to hear from both of you the genesis of these books, but also more specifically, how the young people in your life brought you to write on these particular subjects. So, Laura, let's start with you.
Okay. My origin story, or Here's origin story, actually has two parts. So if I take up too much time, you may have to stop me. Here didn't actually start out as a book about the environment. It started when I was volunteering at a local elementary school, and the teacher commented to me that she wished she had some kind of a book that would help her grade 1-2 students understand the land acknowledgement that was read at the start of every school day. I don't know whether that's customary in American schools, but in Canada, the land acknowledgement names the original inhabitants of the territory where people are gathered. Then there's an expression of thanks for the privilege of living and working on the land. And it usually concludes with some kind of statement of intent to work toward more just and right relationships. So I thought, well, there's a challenge. And I tried to think, how can I help these young suburban kids kind of stretch their imaginations and conceive that the place where they play soccer and ride their bikes and go to school was home, or has been home to other people. And what I came up with was, I thought, okay, I'm not going to try to stretch them too far too fast. So I'm going to start where they are, which is right in their own homes. And rather than sort of pulling them back hundreds of years, just to take one step and say, okay, who lived in your place before you in that space? And how do you know that? Are there little clues? Is there evidence? Did they leave anything behind? And then gradually keep stepping further and further back in time until we reach the first people. So I put together this story. I thought it was an interesting concept, and I submitted it to an editor. And she came back and, among other things, said to me, could you perhaps give this more of an environmental dimension? So I thought about it and thought, well, maybe I can do more than zoom back in time. Maybe I can zoom out in space and create this kind of overview effect. But I didn't really just want to write a book because an editor told me that I should. So it needed to be genuine. So what I did was to try to create or to clarify my own intentions and the message that I wanted to send. And to do that, I had to think about my own children. In particular, my son, Ian. Now, Ian, from the time he was just very, very small, loved animals, all kinds of animals, but especially ancient ones. Paleozoic era was his specialty from the time he was about 3. So extinction was something that was a concept that he was aware of. And when he was about 4, there was a period of time when he became acutely anxious. He developed all kinds of nervous mannerisms. He had trouble sleeping. He resisted going to school. And I thought maybe he was being bullied. But then one day he was sitting at his little art table in the kitchen, and I went over to see what he was drawing, and it looked like some kind of a desert planet. And I said to him, Bud, can you tell me about what you're drawing? And he looked at me and he said, this is the earth when it gets too hot and everything dies.
Wow.
And well, my heart kind of broke. But I also put the pieces together, and I realized it was the month of April. It was his first year in school. It was Earth Month. He had been hearing about climate change and its catastrophic effect, particularly on the animals that he loved. And I think at the same time, he was hearing about all the things he ought to be doing, to save the planet. And I think that he put those messages together, and what he came away with was, the earth is wrecked and it's your job to fix it. He was 4. So no wonder he couldn't sleep. So when I set out to write here, I had him in mind, and I thought about my own intentions as a parent, and his teacher's good intentions. We have this desire to inform and empower children, but sometimes we place on them a burden that's simply too heavy and really shouldn't be theirs to carry. So I think of here in part as kind of a pastoral response to climate anxiety. I guess I want to say to children, you didn't make this mess. Like, it's been in the making for some time. It's not all on you to clean it up. There are things that you can do, but you're not alone. You're not alone in that. And I know Wilson, I'm sure later on we'll get to this, this big space that exists between the solitary individual and the system. But saying to children, people around the world are working together to find solutions to these problems that we all face. so that's another part of it, but I still retained elements of its original form. So it's it's also about what it means to be both a descendant and an ancestor. We all inherit things, good things and bad things, and we need to figure out what to do with that inheritance and what we want to leave behind for those who come after. So those two streams kind of converged in one very short and simple book.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Wilson, how about for you? Where did the seeds for this book come from, and how did the young people in your life affect that seed taking root?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I love questions about process, and I love to hear other people's journeys, and there are aspects of this book where, I mean, like Laura said, and like your question's asking, Derek, is how much my family shaped it, how much, in that process. But so the book itself actually was supposed to be a companion volume to a book I've been working on for a long time, called Singing the Psalms with My Father. And that book was going to be about the decade that my dad suffered from dementia. And so that all kind of started when I had moved off to do graduate work. I was living in upstate New York. My family's from Kentucky, and my dad had early onset dementia, newly diagnosed. And the first couple of years, or just early on, phone conversations kind of stopped working. Right, we would get back to the same questions, and so the conversation part of connecting was becoming, I guess, more and more attenuated. And so I had an idea, and I was like, I know what we'll do. We'll read the Psalms together. Because when I was a kid, my dad, he was a physics professor, and he read two things to me. He read me the Bible, and he read me from his astronomy textbooks. And so I was like, we'll read the Psalms together, right? There'll be this familiar ground. And then we started reading them together. And it turned out, good liberal Protestants that we were, we didn't know the Psalms. We kind of stumbled through them and would end with the 23rd Psalm, and that was that. And that lasted maybe about 4 calls. But I think that there was like the right impulse there, right? Because there was something going on between me and my dad that the Psalms had resources for, but that I didn't really feel like I had that in my life, right? And so part of it is, one of the things that happens with dementia is this thing called ambiguous loss, right? Where the loss happens gradually, and what you lose isn't often all that clear. So, and also there's all this space in the Psalms for lament, and also for holding together lament and love, lament and hope, loss and kind of an abiding trust. So that project has been kind of taking shape for a long time. Who knows if I'll ever finish that? But when my dad passed right before actually I became a father. But then when I became a father and being a dad, thinking about the future, whereas that project was thinking about a lost past, and I started thinking about the future, it was terrifying, but it was also marked by its own kind of ambiguous losses, right? To where, there is this loss of species, of habitats, but also there's this loss of just kind of any kind of basic trust in the world that we live in. Loss in maybe even the dreams that maybe I thought I had for my son. So again, the Psalms seemed like relevant resources to turn to dwell in spaces that I didn't feel like I was really trained to, or have even the communal support to go to. But then as the book took shape, so both as the Psalms were kind of giving me, I think, things I needed, the kids started giving me the things I needed. Because my son now is 8 years old. He was younger while I was writing this book. But my nephew lives with us, and he's a teenager. And so it has been interesting to see how they have shaped the book, because my son, younger, but also just kind of has like a love of music. And so there's a lot of ways in which the emphasis on joy and play and celebration and wonder that comes from that marks the book. It comes from the Psalms, but also comes from my son Teddy, and it comes from kind of really dwelling in spaces of care and love with children, and seeing the ways that I'm kind of sometimes habituated to look past them, but seeing the power that's kind of lying there. And it's constantly my son that's calling me into that. But then with my nephew, he's older, and for him there is this deep sense, a lot of what Laura was saying about feeling this anxiety about the future, but also feeling this need and this pressure to solve it, and to solve it himself, and for us to solve it. And so also, like the Psalms with my nephew, also kind of shaped the book to be focused on kind of dwelling in spaces that are honest, but also kind of jagged and difficult and messy. And so I guess kind of really following their lead, that really kind of shaped the book as it, those were kind of these kind of resonance with the Psalms.
Yeah. I want to pick up on this a little bit, because I think you make a good point that we know the 20, most of us, good Protestants, we know the 23rd Psalm, and maybe we know a couple others out of context, or maybe even not realizing that they're in the Psalms. But one of the things that your book really highlights is that the Psalms kind of give us a resource to touch on the wide range of emotions that we might feel. And I'm kind of interested in hearing, what did you find in determining which psalm to use? What did you find in just kind of going through the Psalter as you were preparing this book, in terms of being able to deal with the wide range of things that we're feeling about the climate crisis as parents? What did you find that the Psalms were giving you that maybe you wouldn't be able to find somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I find that the scriptures are some of the most radical literature that's just available in the world that I live in. And I didn't feel like that for a long time. Yeah, I kind of grew up in the Bible Belt. I kind of thought the Bible said something else and was owned by different people. And that the liberal Protestant communities that I came from were uncomfortable with it because it was theirs, and that they were kind of right about it. I think that might be part of the story. I think another part of the story is that there is an honesty and a sense of justice, but also a sense of like real communal life that is called for and called into life by the poetry of the Psalms and across the scriptures. And I think that can sometimes, I think, make the communities I come from uncomfortable, because I come from a lot of professional class communities, or professional managerial class communities, and in those contexts, emotion is supposed to be something that's managed, right? This is even like comes down to some of like the common therapeutic tools we're given, is like we're supposed to like observe an emotion, name the emotion, distance yourself from the emotion, right? And so we're constantly called into playing the role of manager. And the kind of relationship that's called for in the Psalms with other people, with creation, and with God, it's not typically to be the manager, right? It's typically to be in a more intimate or more collaborative position. And so in a lot of ways, some of what's helpful and beautiful about the Psalms is challenging. But it's not just challenging. It's similar with kind of what's challenging about slowing down enough to be with children, right? It can sometimes really take some time and effort, but once you're into that space, I mean, it's that opening to love and to intimacy and to really to community. So in the Psalms, it speaks to all these different registers, but then also the Psalms give us this kind of, it's not just like it speaks to them, it gives us a path, right? So it gives us a way to go into a space that maybe we're not comfortable with, but then it holds us, and it holds us, and it allows us to dwell. And so we go to this place, but we're not just kind of like flung out there into the abyss. There is a structure, there is a rhythm, there is a kind of a community and traditions that call us back.
Yeah. I really like the way that you made that comparison between the Psalms and parenting. And any of us who are parents know that trying to manage our children's emotions isn't usually a very fruitful endeavor. And sometimes it's just better to hold them and let them have the emotions that they are feeling, and that they're complex emotions. And Laura, I want to come back to you because I've had the privilege of reading a lot of your work, and getting to talk to you about a lot of your work. And one of the things that is really consistent in your writing is your ability to discuss the complicated and the complex in terms that are simple, but they're not dumbed down. And here's, as you've laid out, it's about the climate crisis, and then you also kind of add in this very complicated level that I wasn't aware of about the land acknowledgement. And so I'm just interested in where that ability and that, not even just ability, but that desire to be able to put really complex issues in understandable, digestible terms that kids can understand without being condescended to, and without being talked down to, and without being belittled. I'm just really interested in hearing about how you've gone about in your work explaining these really complicated issues in kind of simple ways.
It's a good question. First of all, thank you, Derek. I value that compliment highly because that is something that I work very hard at doing. Where does the desire come from? I think the desire comes from respect. I have a lot of respect for children and their capacity to grasp big ideas and big concepts. But obviously they have to be conveyed in a way that's simple and straightforward that children can grasp. So distilled, not chopped up. And I really love that challenge because it forces me to be very clear in my own mind about what it is that I am trying to say. There's no way I could sit down and write a book that, I mean, here I think is the shortest book I've ever written. I don't have a lot of words to work with, and I'm trying to say a lot. So I have to choose them very, very carefully. And I enjoy the challenge of trying to be precise. Yeah, it's a discipline, I guess. The way I do it, I think it's funny because I wasn't really sure how I do it. I know I go through this sort of distillation process. I kind of liken it to making stock or making soup. Actually, like there's always a whole bunch of stuff in there, and some strange alchemy combined with time and a lot of walking helps me get rid of the extraneous part and just leaves behind the essence of what it is I'm trying to say. But I think I usually start by saying, what's the touch point? Where might this idea or this concept become real in a child's experience? So in the case of something like here, I mentioned my son Ian, and I was thinking about that horrible sense of overwhelm that he experienced. And this might sound trivial, but I asked myself, how can I take that feeling and kind of shrink it down to size? And I had this memory of myself. I think I was probably about 3, standing in my bedroom, and I'd taken my toy box and I dumped it. So everything was all over the floor. And I remember my mom coming in and expressing shock and horror. And she said, you can't do anything else until you put every toy back in the box. And I remember standing, and I don't know why this moment sticks out so much for me, but I remember looking at all of it and feeling utterly crushed by the enormity of this task and thinking, I can just never do this. And then my mom, in this moment of grace, coming in and saying, I'll help you. We're going to do one thing at a time. And that's what we did, is it gradually all got picked up. But I remember that feeling of just wanting to, like, either feeling sort of paralyzed or just wanting to shove everything in the closet and slam the door and hope she didn't notice. But if I can find some tiny little experience that might be recognizable to a child, then I can kind of move on from there. So when I wrote here, I started in the child's room and then I ended there. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I think both of you, I think, have a way of inviting us into thinking about complicated issues and inviting young people into thinking about complicated issues in a way that is age appropriate and yet not condescending. And I'm kind of thinking back to last month, we had our conversation with Talitha Aho about dealing with the grief and anger and frustration that many young people are feeling around climate change and around adults' seeming inactivity and indifference to climate change. And I'm just really interested in hearing from both of you about the ability to hold these complicated emotions and to hold them in ways and to address them in ways that are both age appropriate yet not condescending, and how we do that as people who care deeply about young people.
Does it matter who starts?
It does not. No.
Well, I'm going to jump in just because I have something to say that kind of flows out of the previous question. And I'm going to, I guess, break your question into two parts, Derek, because first there's the issue of how do you go about addressing a complex issue with children? And then there's the question about emotions. And I feel, Wilson, that maybe the emotional part might flow more naturally into the psalm. So the first thing I wanted to say, though, is just getting back to this idea of beginning here where children are. It seems to me that no matter what the issue is and how complicated it is, it always makes sense to start with something specific in a child's experience and then use that as the launching point to extend the discussion and to explore bigger issues and ideas. And I was kind of pondering this, and I had another memory, this time of, I think my daughter was about 8, and I had hauled our ridiculously large recycling bin down to the curb, and she came with me, and she was standing in the driveway, and she said with obvious pride and satisfaction, "Wow, look at all that we've recycled." And I was floored, because when I looked at the bin, I saw this mountain of unnecessary plastic packaging that just kind of made me want to weep. I felt huge guilt for generating that much waste, but also, I was frustrated by how hard it is to avoid it. Like, why are my bananas wrapped in plastic? But I also felt anger, that responsibility for that kind of mess is downloaded onto municipalities and consumers, and the manufacturers and industries that create it just kind of do it with impunity. So when I watched my daughter and her delight in our huge recycling bin, I realized that she'd actually been taught to see recycling as a virtue. So in her mind, the more we recycled, the better it was. So I thought, okay, this is a moment. So we seized on that moment and we started talking about recycling and why it's necessary. Why do we use so much plastic and paper? Do we use more of it because we think, oh, I can recycle it? Is there another way? Has it always been this way? What could we do to reduce our own waste? Who could we talk to about some of the bigger issues? we have a little door in the side of our house with a little niche behind it where they used to put the milk bottles for delivery. And so I showed her that, and we talked about how some things were done differently in the past, and it was just expected that you would wash the milk bottles and then put them out, and then they'd be picked up and used again. And so we just took one very specific incident and sort of expanded upon that to make the conversation bigger. But then about the emotions, Wilson, I'm eager to hear what you have to say about this, but I was thinking about lament in the Psalms, and I just got a call at work last week from somebody asking me if I could recommend a children's book about lament. And it caught me off guard, because we've got all kinds of books about grief, but they're almost all related to very, they're usually connected with death or other forms of loss, but there wasn't really much for children in terms of helping them express lament over the climate crisis. And I think there's lots of scope to do that through art or music or ritual of some kind, but that question kind of got me thinking, how do we do this better? Yeah.
I'm a little intimidated by the question, to be honest, because I mean, when it comes to thinking about how to teach children, I don't know. I have been guilty in the past of being like the person that's invited to do the children's moment, and I'm like, okay, kids, let me talk to you about what Kierkegaard says about love, and probably not that awesome. And there's some gendered things going on here with that, but I think that like with this book in general, and kind of with how I approach the question, is I think maybe my kind of like not taking the position of an expert is probably a pretty good start, and maybe like entering into a space of accompaniment where we're kind of exploring together is part of how I approach this, and also part of how I think about the book, because I think that when you're talking about like these big, like hairy, impossible, systemic sized questions, I sometimes I worry about like saying it right, whereas what really is just needed is it's like a space where those questions can be like lived and kind of experimented with for a while. So to make this kind of concrete, instead of so in one of the chapters of the book talk about celebrating holidays, right? And so we could have conversations about kind of waste and consumption, but maybe one of the ways of engaging this like in a familial level and with kids is trying to figure out different ways of celebrating the holiday together, and creating that as a space where those questions kind of dwell and you try and live into them. And so there are pieces of it that are like conversation pieces, but then there's also pieces of it that are just like social practice pieces and liturgy pieces and celebration pieces. And so I think, for me, a lot of my approach to these kind of environmental issues is just how do we create a space where together we can keep on experimenting with this and keep on trying to do something different.
Yeah.
One of the things sorry, I was just going to pop in for a second, Wilson. One of the things I really liked about that section on celebration was in your description, I had the sense that the paring back didn't feel at all punitive. In fact, it wasn't, your celebration wasn't less than for having things taken away from it. It was actually more and richer for it. And I thought that was quite lovely, and also true to my own experience with my kids too.
Yeah. I echo that. I feel like that was one of the things that, as I was reading that section, I was going, that actually feels more celebratory. That actually feels more joyful and more with the spirit of where the holidays should be. And one of the things that, as you were talking, Wilson, you continually come back to how we do these things together. And you come back to the idea over and over throughout the book that although our individual acts of climate justice are helpful, that they're not the way forward, and that the way forward for us is a collective way forward. And I'm really interested, and Laura, you might have some thoughts on this too, but how do we guide our children away from individualistic thinking on working on these issues when so often we are told things like, hey, you need to drive less, hey, you need to stop eating meat, hey, you need to recycle, when oftentimes what is really required of us is to build better systems. So how do we guide children away from thinking about these issues in individualistic terms?
Yeah, I think that is, I think that's one of the biggest challenges facing kind of environmental movements, creation justice movements, is the way that has that kind of individualism underlies a lot of the approaches, right? To where the whole carbon footprint thing, right? It came from British Petroleum advertising campaign, and it was effective because it fits within all these kind of class narratives we have, especially right, professional class people who like to look at themselves as being productive and efficient, and so kind of get stuck in that. And so it ends up taking a movement that should be all about community, collective power, systems, and it's taken all these people with passion and energy, and it's made them into kind of what outsiders feel are like scolds, right? So instead of like, we have this shared thing, the earth, let's work for a better world, it's focused on all these small details. So but anyway, the kind of thinking about constructively, then how do we begin to get beyond that apparatus? I mean, I think it's, in general, it's about forget consumption, just look at the communal level, look at social practices, look at relationships, look at places, rooted places, try and root places, and you just look at that level. And that's a lot of what this book and my other work is about, is not about providing a blueprint, how do you do this in your context, but it's about how do you attend to your context, how do you begin to thicken your relationships and deepen them with spiritual dimensions so as you can build collective power. To get specific, so in this book, a lot of what I'm thinking about is about prayer, and I think that's maybe a space that we can also kind of invite young people into. There are plenty of traditions of prayer that are very inwardly focused, that are very individualistic. Prayer is not just going to be healing, kind of a fix-all for that. But I think, again, one of the reasons I turn to the Psalms is there are all these traditions of communal prayer with the Psalms. The Psalms give us all these prayers that match personal conflict and personal trials, but always have a communal dimension, and a dimension with kind of located in creation, a dimension that is kind of connected to the divine. So I think that there's all kinds of ways in which just the simple act of prayer is an opening up of that kind of inwardly focused self. And and honestly, our son, and this is maybe about gifts that he has, or I don't know, but he regularly will intervene with some like kind of random prayer service of his own, right? So like this past Sunday, he was like complete rebellion about going to church, but then by the time he came home, he basically recreated a worship service for us. It was at church. So I think there's all these different ways in which if we pray communally, if we kind of, and also if we bring some levity and joy into prayer, it's not just give some space for lament, but also give some space to where like there's space for collaboration and participation, but also space for joy. I think that prayer can be one of those spaces where that kind of individualism is countered.
I was just going to say, at the risk of sounding too simple, giving children an opportunity to be in community and making it possible for them to be embedded in a community that's larger than the family unit. So whether that's a congregation or a local environmental group, there's something that's really powerful, like spiritually and psychologically powerful, about being with a group of like-minded people. Whatever kind of work it is you're doing, whether it's, gardening or creating art or lamenting or protesting, whatever it is, when you do it with other people, it has a kind of energy or a critical mass that it doesn't have otherwise. And I think that, there's something about doing things together that is both consoling and hopeful.
Yeah. So I know both of you have had a chance to read each other's books, and I want to make sure that there's time for you two to ask each other questions. But I also want to remind folks that if they have any questions, that they can put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom, not in the chat, and we'll be getting to those questions in a moment. But I wanted to ask a couple more closing questions of my own. Laura, in the book, you have this young girl who moves into a house, and the previous inhabitants of the house have left some good things behind and left some bad. And that to me was such a beautiful and, again, age-appropriate way of talking about systems of injustice without saying the words systems of injustice, right? How do we talk to, in your experience, how do you talk to young people about the bad things left behind, and then encouraging them along with us to not leave more bad behind?
That is such a good question. And I feel like I am continually trying to figure it out. Wilson, I was interested in hearing you talk about the influence both of your nephew and your son when you were writing my book. You're writing your book, sorry. I find that as my kids get older, I mean, they're all teens now. The way I see certain questions or approach them shifts as they grow. I mean, that phrase "left some things behind" in this book is intentionally vague because I wanted there to be a lot of space for readers to interpret that to begin with something that's quite concrete and then go from there. I kind of feel like I'm constantly coming back to this "here, start where you are" answer, because I think that whatever it is we're talking about with children and young people, it's helpful to start with what's most concrete and most familiar. So when it comes to something like inheritance, I mean, most of us can relate to that, whether it's a physical object, something important that has been handed down to us, genetic traits and characteristics. I mean, we all understand that some of those are desirable and some of them not so much. And then we can kind of move on from there to less concrete aspects of our inheritance, like ideas and attitudes, worldviews, and so on. We're all descendants, but we're also ancestors who will leave our own legacy. When I was thinking about this question and how it applied to my own life and my relationship with my kids, and what I thought of first is that I am a member of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and my denomination cooperated with the Canadian government in running residential schools. So that's a horrific legacy. And it's one that I wasn't even aware of until I was well into adulthood. And then when I started to learn about it, then, it became this challenge. Well, what do I do with this knowledge? Just as a person, as a member of the church, but also as a parent. How do I even talk about this? So the first step for me was to try to educate myself. And then I wanted to begin to tell the story to my children, but it wasn't my story to tell. So I looked to picture books by Indigenous writers to help my own children understand that whole system from the point of view of those who had been through it, but could express it in a way that was authentic, but also age appropriate. So when it came to that question, and I think a lot of others, I usually start with the, where are we question. How did we get here? So let's try to tell the story and listen to as many voices as possible so we get a more nuanced understanding of how we came to this point. Where do we need to go? And what needs to be done to make that happen? So 4 pretty basic questions, but they can be applied differently whether you're dealing with younger children or young adults. So again, it's a matter of, like in that case, when my kids were young, I started with things that were familiar to them. So they have the experience of school, they know about belonging to a family, they know about having a particular culture. So then I could say, well, what would happen if we took some of those things away? Like if you were suddenly removed from your family, or if you weren't allowed to speak your language, or the way you wear your hair or your clothing was taken from you. Can you imagine? Can you even begin to imagine what that would be like? So you're beginning to build empathy. And then what happened is that as my kids got older, they began to explore some of those issues in their own way. And my middle daughter, for instance, decided that she wanted to take some of this knowledge that she'd gained and share it with the community. So she consulted an Indigenous educator and some organizations and ended up creating a heart garden using some of the land around our church. And she researched names of children who had died at a residential school run by our denomination, and she painted memorial stones with their names and put them in the garden along with a sign kind of telling the community this is what this space is for. And I don't know what's going to happen with those seeds ultimately, but something happened in her. And I would see people walking down the sidewalk, and sometimes they'd walk by the church and just stop, and you'd see them go over and start reading. And so all of that is to say, we have these huge questions about what we inherit and what we want to leave behind. Being honest about that with children, even when they're very young, and allowing them to kind of grow into some of their own, I don't know, solutions is the right word, but grow toward a different way of doing things and a different way of seeing the world. That's what I'm hopeful for.
Well, I think one of the common threads between the 2 books is seemingly the need to tell our young people better stories. And Wilson, I'm thinking specifically about the opening of chapter 5 of your book, and you're specifically throwing the giving tree under the bus. But I'm wondering, how do we, kind of my last question for both of you is, how do we begin to counter the stories that are so deeply ingrained in our culture, and counter them with more life-giving stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways is, for me, it is maybe really beginning to see with more clarity some of the negative stories that we have. So I think one of the kind of narrative structures that's really insidious in the culture that I come from is kind of these stories about winners and losers, right? Maps onto the American dream, et cetera, et cetera. And there's like a way in which that story, there's some obvious ways in which maybe we can, probably most of the people on this webinar are like, yeah, we don't like that story. If the winner and loser story is about Big Daddy, right? That like, he's has all the stuff because he's bigger and stronger and smarter and works harder. I think we can all, reject that. But then there's all this kind of, again, coming back to the class thing, all this professional class stuff about winners and losers, right? It's about like kind of, instead of like the dominating winners, it's about the the diligent achievers, right? And all these kind of stories we have about working hard and being smart, following the rules. And I think that, like, when it comes to parenting, I think that kind of narrative structure, those stories often guide what we trust and where we like push our kids into, right? So when we get nervous about the future, what's the story we cling on to? Well, it's like, be a diligent achiever, right? Make sure that they have, get access to the right schools so they can be on the right side of the fence in the future. And so I think that, like, that the imagination of those kinds of stories, or of trusting in those kind of structures, I think it's too small. And so again, pulling from the Psalms, there's this is something I do in the book, right, where it's winners and losers story versus the wicked and the just story, right? So one of the narrative structures in the Psalms is that actually wealth and power is usually something that's accumulated by people who have done things that are, violent, deceitful, and exploitative. And so it's not so much that those are winners, it's that those are the wicked. But then there's this whole other path that's illuminated by the category of the just, right? This is the story not of people who necessarily follow all the rules, and so it pays off for them at the end, but of people who are focused on the common good. And that pays off in the end, not because they get honor, but because they get community, right? Focused on the common good, also focused on justice and joy, and the least of these, those kind of ways of living, those narratives, that is what leads to kind of happily ever after. And I think that kind of making that shift into that narrative structure, and seeing that the ways that plays out even in how we think about children in the future, I think is important, right? So to have this vision of hope around something like the commons, right? To think about, what story are we trying to animate people toward in the future, is this tradition the common good, right? Because and so I guess I've skirted away a little bit from like the literal telling of stories, right? Because I think that, there's this kind of there are the actual stories we tell, and then there are all these social scripts, right, that are reflective of those stories. And I think if we want to tell better stories with our kids, we need actual stories, right? And thank you, Laura, for having them, right? Because and those moments of stories are moments of reorientation, right? They're moments of clarity. But stories have all these afterlives, and they also have all these tendrils, right? To where if they are powerful, if they are incarnated in what we do in our home, right? They make sense if we can see them at work being staged in an everyday context with our friends, right? And so I think part of the work then is to identify the ways that these insidious stories have, we see them not just in Disney movies, but we see them in our everyday interactions, right? But then to also try and figure out ways to creatively read these other stories, actual stories, but then also think about how can we perform these together in everyday space so that they can actually shape our hearts and our lives.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, what you said about incarnating or embodying the stories in our own lives and communities and families. My approach to this question, not surprisingly, is to think more in terms of the particular stories. And I have a host of stories that I think are particularly good. And Derek, I've given you some of my favorites. By no means all, but I'm such a believer in the need for well, the like the tagline on my website is writing stories that make us bigger on the inside. I think that we are in desperate need of stories that enlarge us collectively, like as a society, that will help us mature and grow up and kind of transcend the dualistic thinking we have that divides people from one another and humans from the earth and so on. We just need stories that are more integrated and life-giving. And so I tried to think, okay, if I were to put that into some categories, I think we need stories that encourage attentiveness and mindfulness, actually paying attention to the little details of the world around us. And this is so natural for young children because they're curious and they love to look at things, whether it's, the worm on the sidewalk or the leaf, or we need stories about community and hospitality that nurture this sense of mutuality and relationship. I think we need specific stories. I love the phrase, the common good. I think we need stories about people who are motivated by the common good. We need them to counter these other narratives that are so prevalent. And we need stories about connection and interdependence. So, how we belong to one another and to the whole cosmos, and how all of these things are interrelated. So basically, I think we need stories that shape our imaginations in constructive ways, and they don't have to be stories about the environment, but they have to be stories that allow us to envision and imagine life-giving solutions to problems. I can give titles.
Laura did give us some titles, and I put them in a Google Doc that is in the chat if you want to check that out. We did have a question in the Q&A, and I wanted to make sure that we got to this before we run out of time. Sylvia asks this, I think it's a great question. I wonder if it is more difficult both for children to understand what is happening to creation and to envision what healing might look like because children have less interactions and immersion in creation than in previous generations. If there's no sense of wonder in creation and lack of what their role is in the community of creation, it is then difficult to know what creation is asking from us. All this to say, do you think that we need to cultivate children's community relationship to creation as well?
Absolutely. I think that's critical. I think it was Stephen Jay Gould who says, we won't fight for what we don't love. And I know that's a very violent metaphor, and it's hard to love what you don't know.
Yeah. And I think another side of that is that sometimes I think that when we think of creation, maybe we aren't looking close enough to home, right? So we're imagining that kids have to have an engagement with nature as we might imagine it, like had seen as a child, or maybe even like nature as something that's big and expansive. I think for me, the environmental justice definition, right, of what they're engaged with, which is the environment, which is where you work, live, and play. I think that's where we need to be focused. And I think maybe sometimes the conversations about nature or creation maybe are also not helping our kids find the places to have experience, because we might not see the backyard as creation enough, right? I don't know if that makes sense. But.
One of the books I mentioned is called Outside You Notice, and it's about, all of the things or it's encouraging children to notice little details when they go outside. But the author and illustrator took special care to make sure that there were urban environments represented in it, because, it's easy to have a very kind of idyllic and idealistic vision of what interacting with nature is all about. But, it's also about watching how the dandelion forces its way up through the crack in the sidewalk, or it's about finding the maple key that falls down and putting it in a cup with some potting soil and watching it germinate and just being amazed at this. There are there are sources of awe and wonder all around us.
Well, it feels like maybe not a complete place to stop, but maybe a good one for today. I feel like we could have kept this conversation going for much longer, and I probably would have enjoyed that, and I think you all would have too. But we are going to wrap up here. So I just want to thank Laura, Alary, and I want to thank Wilson Dickinson for the wonderful books that you've written. Thank you for your time here today to talk with each other and to talk with all of us. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. As I mentioned, both of the books are available through the link that you use for the webinar that you use for your registration. So you can go ahead and purchase either and both of those books. And we want to invite you to join us for our next part of this series, which is going to happen on September 12th at 6 p.m. for a discussion with Amy Houts, author of God's Creation is Something to Fight For, and Betsy Painter, author of All of Creation, Understanding God's Planet and How We Can Help. And we'll have a link for that in the chat. But once again, Laura and Wilson, thank you so much for just your creativity and your energy, and thank you for sharing your writing with us, and thank you for sharing this time with us this evening.
Thank you for the opportunity, Derek.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. And I'm looking forward to your book. And I want to also throw out there just how wonderful Laura's book is. She shared a copy with me, and I read it with my son. And it's such an evocative book. He immediately kind of did what the book like invites you to do. Like the next day, he had pulled out this piece of paper about who else had lived in his room. It's a beautiful book, and it's been a joy to be able to talk with you. And thank you, Derek, for this invitation.
Thank you both. Everyone, good night, and we'll see you again next month.